So, as December 25th rolled around, I realized that I just wasn't going to meet the deadline to finish my first video essay, which is mostly my fault for choosing something so holiday related. So, I decided that it would be better to just get started on the next video, which doesn't really have any kind of deadline to it, and that I could return to this video later in the future if I do continue to commit to this channel. There are a few clips thrown in here, but for the most part, this video is just a lot of still images and audio. In the future, I'd like to have a lot more going on visually in these videos, so please bear with me for this first one. And if you have any suggestions for what you'd like to see on the Dog Bowl next, please leave them in the comments below. If I had to take a guess, I'd say that Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is probably the most cinematically adapted literary work of all time. Even just this year, 2 more premiered on streaming services. I can remember enjoying a few different versions of the story growing up, but it wasn't until the 2009 Disney version that I became interested in reading the actual book. I listened to a review where the film critic described A Christmas Carol as Charles Dickens' ghost story. I was intrigued enough to finally get to know the original version for myself. I was blown away at how dark the actual story was throughout the supernatural parts, rather than just at the tail end when the ghost of Christmas Future appears as some rendition of death. Each ghost forces Scrooge to face the realities of humanity that he's decided to shut out in favor of wealth. I was also blown away at how timeless the descriptions were of the specters, and while I'm aware that Dickens probably wasn't the first person to describe the spirits as he does here, it's easy to imagine how influential he was on early filmmakers' portrait of spirits in general. What also fascinated me at the time as a young atheist was that it was one of the first secular Christmas stories, if not the first. For the first episode of The Dog Bowl, I'm going to break down the themes of A Christmas Carol and find out why this classic has persisted throughout the years. You know, aside from the fact that it's a public domain work tied into a holiday, I want to find out why a story rooted in so many Christian themes and references manages to be told time and time again for a new audience that live in a very different world from the author. I'll also examine how Dickens incorporated the overwhelming Christian culture of his day into the story, both through the imagery he evokes and the moral themes expressed throughout the story. Let's dig into the Dog Bowl and see how A Christmas Carol can help us fill the God-shaped hole in our hearts.
Why do you doubt your senses? There might be a bit of bad beef, a blot of mustard, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!
An aspect of this holiday favorite that is never talked about is how the narrator breaks the fourth wall, especially during the first stave. Within the first few paragraphs, Dickens goes on a tangent about why a doornail would be deader than a coffin nail before giving into the appeal to tradition fallacy. It's the kind of fourth wall breaking joke that you wouldn't really expect to find in a novel from the 18th century. And this self-aware humor is surprisingly a mainstay of the novel. In every version of A Christmas Carol, we see Scrooge catch on to the routine that the ghosts are using by the time he encounters the ghost of Christmas Future. This journey feels different, and I'd say even more rewarding when accompanied by Dickens' narration. Now, let's take at our protagonist. Or maybe it's an antagonist? Well, he's definitely the main character. If I had to say who the most book-accurate portrayal was, I'd hands down give it to Jim Carrey's mocap performance in the aforementioned Disney adaptation. Robert Zemeckis' mocap films were constantly criticized for their dead-eyed background characters, But it's hard to deny the level of detail they put into bringing Scrooge to life in a way that can never be captured by even the most talented makeup artists. The frail frame, the hooked nose, the scowl. Honestly, Mr. Burns, with his thin frame and constant sneer, was probably the closest thing to Dickens' Scrooge until 2009. Considering we live in a post-1% world, the kind of greed that Scrooge represents is more accurate than ever. One of the many issues with our modern economy today, as is later stated by nephew Fred, is that money has a tendency to get stuck at the top where it's not being spent, therefore no longer circulated through the system. Either that or a Reaganomic hurricane is overdue to hit the American people at any moment. I wouldn't hold your breath. At the time that A Christmas Carol came out, the West had just experienced the Industrial Revolution, and the idea of the self-made man as we know today was still a fairly recent invention. In the past, wealth had traditionally been the concern of nobility. While there certainly were cases of people attaining fortune and status, moving your way up in the world wasn't really seen as an option for most people. Nobility and the wealth associated with it was considered a divine right, and so religious organizations appealed to this divine right to collect charity. Dickens knew that he had to appeal to a new kind of nobility, in an economic sense that is, that didn't necessarily attribute their wealth and fortune to God. The Scrooge archetype has stayed with us and remained relevant through the generations, because millions today see the so-called self-made men who devalue the people and institutions that allow them to have wealth in the first place. Dickens was truly ahead of his time in treating the new diagnosis of greed in a post-industrial world. Moving on to the setting and opening, while modern adaptations such as Netflix's Scrooge: A Christmas Carol have secularized 1840s London, there's no denying that Dickens portrayed the heavily Christian culture that existed in its time. While Dickens never addressed Scrooge's relationship to Christianity, there's no denying that all our supporting characters in the opening, Bob, his nephew Fred, and the charity collectors, are faithful Christians. Because that's just what most people were at the time in Victorian England. And, well, just look at their dialogue. When Fred appeals to Scrooge's sense of holiday spirit, he mentions its name's sacred origin, Christ obviously, but talks about how the spirit of Christmas is what's strongest at this time of year most. I don't know what it is about the winter solstice that makes Western cultures embrace revelry, but there is a history of holidays predating Christmas, which even the Catholic Church admits influenced the holiday's placement on the calendar. A line that has always fascinated me was, think of others as fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creature bound on other journeys. I certainly see the appeal to Christian brotherly love in this line, but the admission that it is only around Christmas time that this egalitarian mindset comes out reminds me of an aspect of Saturnalia. During this Roman holiday, which took place from December 17th to December 23rd, slaves are set free and considered equal to their masters. I think the seasonal spirit that Fred is appealing to is one that existed long before Christianity made its way to Europe and manifested itself as Christmas in the modern day. The opening in Scrooge's counting house also foreshadows the three spirits he'd go on to meet later that night. His faithful employee, Bob, is a reflection of Scrooge's own past, and in some ways represents a path alternate to Scrooge's own. Bob remains poor to support his family, while his boss never had one and got rich. His nephew Fred represents what he could have in this lifetime if he'd take his kin's invitation, and when he exits the building, the two charity collectors have an opportunity to walk in seamlessly through the open door, much the same way the Ghost of Christmas Future enters at the end of the third stave. The charity collectors begin their proposal by appealing to the spirit of Scrooge's deceased partner, Jacob Marley. And even though he would have denied them anyway, it's in keeping with Marley's memory that Scrooge refuses to give them anything. I have to mention another timeless moment from this introduction: Scrooge defaulting on his taxes to going to help the needy. Apparently, it's been a long time honored tradition to say, "I pay my taxes, don't I?" As we leave the counting house, Dickens shows us the unequal power dynamics between employer and employee. In this moment, I describe Scrooge as displaying objectivist tendencies. He rationalizes to Bob why Christmas should be like any other day for him to make another profit. But ultimately, he does give in to the culture, allowing Bob the day off in return for an earlier shift the next morning. Some may see this moment as the first glimmer of kindness in Scrooge, but my reading has always been a little bit more cynical. I believe that Scrooge figured fewer people would come in on a holiday anyways, and so Bob, too naive and spineless to realize that, thought that he was making him a good deal. Something that I'd never even caught until rereading the book for this video essay is that the big house Scrooge lives in actually belonged to Marley before he passed away, which makes one wonder where he was willing to live before he ever even inherited the place. I mean, we're talking about a guy that burns the barest minimum of fuel anytime he wants to be warm. I think that inheriting his partner's house is symbolic of the fate Scrooge will inherit if he doesn't change. Entering Scrooge's home, Dickens begins to use narrative devices that are much more in line with a ghost story than a feel-good morality tale. Marley begins the haunting with what we'd consider by today's standards a jump scare, briefly appearing to unsettle Scrooge before making his true presence known. The old miser becomes paranoid and searches the house, before settling down in front of the fire for dinner. In this setting, Dickens gives a fascinating account of the fireplace that I'd like to read verbatim. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cain's and Abel's, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abraham's, Belshazzar's, apostles putting off the sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like an ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with the power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of Marley's head on every one. I don't believe this was Dickens' intent, but I read it as a passing of the old salvation myths and the beginning of a new salvation myth, more grounded in the material world and history of our main character, yet still invoking the supernatural to bring about empathy. While Scrooge is very much surrounded by Christianity, Dickens makes it clear that it is in fact Marley's memory that saves Scrooge. So, really quick, I just want to make it clear right now that while I'm breaking down the symbolism in A Christmas Carol from an atheist perspective, I'm in no way arguing that this is one of those stories that all takes place in Scrooge's head. Personally, I find that kind of reading to be reductive unless it's the author's intent. After the ghost of his partner appears, Dickens puts Scrooge and Marley in a dialogue to address Scrooge's materialistic worldview, one which I admittedly hold. Even in 1843, Dickens has enough awareness of medicine and psychology to have Scrooge rationalize his experience as a result of poor food or vivid dreaming. To me, this skeptical exchange is part of what makes the story feel surprisingly modern, especially in an internet flooded with fan theories about why your favorite piece of fantasy media is all an escape in the main character's messed up head. By the way, if you're one of those people, it's because you want to escape to a fantasy world that only existed in your head, not your favorite protagonist that you so desperately want to relate to. But getting back to A Christmas Carol. In response to, "Who are you?" Marley tells Scrooge, "Ask, who was I?" That Marley thinks of his living self, who he was, as a separate entity from his current self, as if though death has robbed him of some distinct part of his person. This would seem to track if we consider that his ghostly form has a chain he forged in life, a unique appendage to his existence as a soul. While describing his regret, Marley makes two references to Christianity. The first is the Christian spirit, here referring broadly to the people of the Christian faith that would have inhabited Victorian England. The second is an analogy to the star that guided the three wise men. I believe that Dickens here was appealing to the shared culture of the era to remind the target readers about their duty to their fellow man, which at this time were likely Christians familiar with stories of the Nativity. Something I had always been confused by is the part that Jacob seems to imply that the hauntings will take place over 3 nights. And even Scrooge is surprised to find that the visits all took place in a single night at the end. A friend of mine had an interesting idea that Dickens may have been invoking the 3 nights Jesus lay dead before ascending to heaven, which would line up with Scrooge awaking at the end of the book. What I've always thought was compelling about Marley's lament is that his regrets are that he neglected the people in need around him. Ultimately, it is Marley's neglect of humanity, not faith, that binds his chains as a ghost. I also appreciate the way Scrooge subtly shows disinterest in changing despite realizing he also wants to avoid Marley's fate. Self-reported salvation stories by divine revelation, both old and new, often claim that they flipped their beliefs and attitudes after seeing evidence of the supernatural. Dickens, however, doesn't expect us to buy that Scrooge is capable of a sudden radical character transformation just because a ghost told him to be nicer. Now that I think about it, it's kind of a setup for a supernatural therapy appointment. But nonetheless, Scrooge still has to put in the work to examine himself if he truly wishes to change. Excluded from most adaptations of A Christmas Carol is the conclusion to Marley's visit, in which he leads Scrooge to the window to gaze upon other souls damned with chains like his deceased partners. The hell, if it can be called that, which Dickens conceives, is not filled with thieves, adulterers, and other common figures of sinners, but rather it is occupied by spirits of men familiar to Scrooge, implying they're wealthier individuals who would have mingled in his social circles. As the chapter closes, Dickens writes, he tried to say, "humbug," but he stopped at the first syllable. This is the last time Scrooge even considers saying the word that has become his iconic catchphrase throughout the many adaptations, and is only uttered once more in Stave 3 by his nephew. Humbug, in case you didn't know, refers to something that is deceptive. By refusing to utter the word, he displays that he's willing to learn from what he's about to experience next, instead of just dismissing it as a humbug.
You, the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?
As this chapter opens, Dickens distorts Scrooge's perception of time, waking him at midnight despite having gone to bed at past 2 a.m. This causes Scrooge to try to contemplate the reality of his current predicament, so much so that he's unable to go back to sleep before the ghost of Christmas past shows up. It's interesting that just before beginning an examination of his past, Scrooge's mind was already in a state of self-reflection. Dickens had made this character vulnerable to his memories. As the first ghost makes their presence known, Dickens writes, "As close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It's a fascinating fourth wall break that could be read in a number of ways. Was Dickens, aware of his own mortality, trying to make future readers believe that he was with us in spirit as we read? Or is the narrator an entity in itself that has come to life when we reread the classic each time? It may also serve to remind us to pay attention to the story as if though we were being watched while doing so. As a kid, I always really enjoyed the Ghost of Christmas Future segments the most, and they might still be my favorites in the cinematic adaptations. But when it comes to the original text, the entrance of the Ghost of Christmas Past has always been the most captivating to me. The detail provided by Dickens could almost be described as Lovecraftian. They're an androgynous figure with
contradictory features,
such as a face that appears both young and old, a body that shifts visibility like the gleam on a coin, and a strange light coming from their head. I'm aware of two adaptations that visualize this light as a flame, which is fair considering the spirit also carries an extinguisher cap. But ultimately, the Ghost of Christmas Past's light, like the rest of its form, is whatever the reader imagines at the time. I don't know that any adaptation could ever truly capture the otherworldly nature of the Ghost of Christmas Past. Stepping outside the book for a moment, it's almost worth noting that the spirit's androgyny has made them the only truly gender-fluid role throughout the adaptations. I can't claim to have done the research, but broadly speaking, it's the only ghost I've seen that tends to be played by a female actress in more faithful adaptations. I've chosen to use they/them pronouns to refer to the Ghost of Christmas Past because of the mix of clips that you're probably watching, but in the original text, they're simply referred to as it. All the spirits are. I know this kind of makes me Freudian trash, but I can't help but to wonder if having the Ghost of Christmas Past played by a woman makes the role a more maternal figure in a way, capable of making Scrooge more nostalgic for his childhood. The description of the ghost also evokes in my mind associations with the Greek god Apollo. In Greek mythology, Apollo is also described as having a youthful appearance, though being the wisest among the gods, which lines up with the description of a face being both old and young. The light on his head is also reminiscent of Apollo's association to the sun and wisdom. This last one is more my headcanon, but I've often imagined the tunic with summer flowers that he wears as being more of the Greek style. As Scrooge interacts with the spirit, the narration says that Scrooge wishes to see the spirit with his cap on. The spirit replies to the narration as if though Scrooge had spoken it out loud. Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap and forced me through the whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow? The spirit here is referring to Scrooge's neglected memories, which we're about to see played out. For a book that predates the field of psychoanalysis by nearly half a century, it's quite impressive how accurately Dickens allegorizes self-examination of one's own memories. The spirit takes Scrooge to his childhood, where he delights in nostalgia for the familiar scenery of his schoolyard. Having been reminded of his childhood, he regrets shooing away a young caroler. Thankfully now, we have door cameras, so instead of telling carolers to shoo, you can just pretend like you're not home. They walk up the road to a boarding school, where we see a young Scrooge neglected and living in solitude, while his friends leave for home until one year, his younger sister comes to pick him up, revealing that their father has become a changed man and would like the young Ebenezer to come home to be with his family. It's here where we begin to understand Scrooge's comfort with solitude, and perhaps even the beginnings of a cycle of abuse. The great irony of this scene is that his sister, mother to his nephew, rescued him from solitude when he was forced into it, while in the present day, he chooses solitude over his only living relative's invitation for company. Speaking as a proud introvert who needs his alone time to recharge, I'm more than willing to admit we are evolved to be social creatures that need company as much as we need solitude. If not more so, I admit begrudgingly. Some people like Fred feel the familial connection even more deeply than others, causing him to give Scrooge a chance year after year. Next, we see Scrooge as a young employee preparing his work for a Christmas party. Once again, Dickens gives Scrooge a parallel, though rather than his younger self, it's his employer, Mr. Fezziwig. The ghost calls his employer's generosity a small matter to make these silly folk so full of gratitude. Scrooge retaliates by defending Fezziwig's kindness and generosity, even though it's within his power to make their workdays even harder. I love how Scrooge is never chastised by the ghost of Christmas past, but rather sees the hypocrisy of his preferred treatment versus the way he treats Bob. This is an example of cognitive bias, in which we may see our own suffering as unjustified, but the suffering of others as justified by their own actions. Here, Scrooge realizes that he's the cause of the suffering. Following this realization, we are taken to a scene where another young Scrooge is being dumped for valuing money more than his fiancée. Dickens effectively uses body language and a few spoken words here to sum up the younger Scrooge's uncomfortable feelings while he is confronted by Belle's questions. I'd say Belle is usually written better in adaptations where they introduce her earlier, but in her brief and sudden appearance, she still manages to feel like a three-dimensional character. Dickens writes their breakup as if though you've turned to the final page of a romantic novel. Or maybe it's the climax of a romantic comedy. I don't know what you read. It's easy to imagine Belle having her own story, where she comes to terms with all the ways that Scrooge has changed before breaking off their engagement. This version of Scrooge also serves as a bridge between his former and current self. Belle says that Scrooge had found another idol to replace her, a clear reference to idolatry. Once again, Dickens alludes to the notion that salvation is found in humanity, not financial wealth. This time in the form of companionship. Finally, the spirit shows Scrooge Belle with her own family on the night his partner Marley died. It's revealed that while Belle has the love and comfort of her own family, Scrooge has such a distant relationship with his so-called best friend that he won't even go and visit him on his deathbed. No longer able to bear the painful memories, Scrooge snatches the cap to extinguish the spirit. Once again, a modern reader could easily interpret this as the end of a difficult but necessary therapy session to get to the root of his problems. Also, like a modern therapist, the Ghost of Christmas Past was working on a limited time frame. Dickens, a man truly ahead of his time.
Scrooge knew that the second of the ghosts was due to appear. Yet now, as the clock finished striking...
Nothing.
Ho, 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 ho! Come in and know me better, man! Ho, 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 ho!
The Ghost of Christmas Present introduces himself uniquely from the other spirits by having Scrooge approach him rather than the other way around. It begins with an enticing light that calls Scrooge out of bed and back into his fire room, which has now been decorated with a throne of richly prepared foods, where the Ghost of Christmas Present invites Scrooge in with, "Come in and know me better, man." The giant is dressed in a green coat with white fur borders. He bears some resemblance to the classical depictions of Father Christmas, befitting of a ghost of Christmas present. Scrooge takes notice of the rusted scabbard with no sword in it. This may be indicative of Dickens' own particular practice of Christianity. Dickens was a Unitarian that believed salvation was universal through good deeds rather than through a strict worship of God, and had no issues rewriting the Gospels to make them suitable for his own household. I believe that Dickens is alluding here to the meek shall inherit the earth. According to some scholars, the context of this line refers to those who will lay down their arms when it is their time to rule. According to rapture ideology, the meek will inherit the earth after the second coming of Jesus. However, the empty scabbard may be indicative that the meek already have inherited the earth, and so the living incarnation has no need for a sword. He does, however, wield a torch in the shape of a horn, which he uses to stop a quarrel between two men who conclude that it's a shame to fight on Christmas. And later, he uses it to bless Bob Cratchit's house. This apparition is also a representation of the Christian spirit that exists year-round, as indicated in an exchange of dialogue between the ghost and Scrooge. I'll touch more on that soon. Once again, my mind was brought to another member of the Greek pantheon, Dionysus, known for his association with wine and celebration. Celebration becomes especially relevant towards the end of this stave, when we enter his nephew's Christmas party. Lastly, the spirit implies that he has over 1,800 brothers, a vague reference to the unsaid year A Christmas Carol is set in. The ghost takes Scrooge into the world to show him the various positive effects Christmas has on the behaviors of people celebrating it. Everywhere they go, Scrooge is shown how the holiday makes men more generous, thoughtful, and jovial. It's in the early part of this outing that Scrooge addresses the spirit's greater connection to the Christian spirit by questioning why he would have businesses shut down every seventh day, an obvious reference to the Sunday Mass. The spirit replies, "There are some on this earth of yours who lay claim to know us, who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and change their doings on themselves, not us." Here, Dickens inserts a criticism of organized religion, accusing them of using spiritual claims, aka the ghost of Christmas present and his kin, to justify their bad deeds in their name. Dickens' approach to the metaphysical in this regard is a humble one which does not claim to have absolute truth. At the end of the novel, we see that Scrooge does take this lesson to heart by holding the spirit of Christmas close to him every day, which we can assume refers to the generosity the ghost evokes here. While the ghost takes Scrooge to a variety of places, there are two homes that they visit which are especially important to the story. The first is Bob Cratchit's house, where the ghost places a blessing upon his home. Here we see the poverty that Bob and his family endure, but we also see that they're quite happy to have each other despite what little they have. When Dickens had written this story, the target audience was the affluent of his day that could help the poor and needy. Despite their happiness, Dickens doesn't shy away from the reality of the situation and describes the Cratchits as, "They were not a handsome family," aware that some amount of the readers would be aesthetically turned off by the Cratchits and their living conditions. As with Scrooge, Bob must be humanized to the rich man if he is to feel sympathy for him. Perhaps it's the cynic in me, but when Bob toasts to his boss's health, in spite of his family, I can't help but to think of the sunk cost fallacy, in which a person cherishes what they already have as opposed to thinking about the alternatives. In the long run, though, I'd be wrong given that Scrooge does make him his partner by the end of the book. Scrooge also finds himself quickly attached to Bob's youngest child, Tiny Tim, a cripple with a vague ailment that will take his life if his father's economic situation is left unchanged. As a modern reader in the US healthcare system, it feels like such a timeless problem to have medical ailments and the associated costs loom over each of us like a sword of Damocles. While the Cratchits do make reference to their faith, Dickens makes it clear where true happiness lies. The second place that we visit, which is also vastly important to the story, belongs to Scrooge's nephew. His nephew Fred reveals that it has been something of an annual tradition for him to go and invite Scrooge to his party, even though he knows he's going to be rejected every year. From his perspective, he loses nothing, while Scrooge loses out on company and a good dinner, thus proving that even in Victorian England, they knew the best revenge was living your best life. He also points out that Scrooge, being the miser that he is, doesn't even enjoy his wealth because he's so much more concerned with accumulating it. Like Bell and Cratchit before him, Fred reiterates that true wealth is having people around you to love. My favorite turning point for Scrooge is when the party begins to engage in charades. Humans are evolved to be social creatures that have invented all sorts of ways to build bonds among group members. Despite not being physically present, Scrooge feels a rush of dopamine as he plays along with the rest of Fred's house guests. Several studies have concluded that there is a social function to eating and playing with others that goes well beyond childhood bonds, and through this moment, we see Dickens mythologizing the lesson. In spite of the presence of a supernatural being, it's still regular, ordinary people that compel Scrooge to be a better person. So at this point, some of you might be thinking, wait, is he just going to skip over the whole surplus population line? And the answer is no, I'm not. So earlier in the novel, when Scrooge is told that the poor would rather die than go to prison or workhouses, he responds, well, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. The spirit threw his words back at him as he begun to feel sympathy for Tiny Tim's condition. That Scrooge believes there's a surplus at all, the fault of Anglican priest Thomas Robert Malthus, suggests, as the spirit points out, that he is the decider of who is the surplus population, and he's decided that it is the poor. Having traveled the earth with the spirit, Scrooge has now seen the so-called surplus population he dismissed at the beginning of the book. Returning to the present, as in the present of the book, not the Christmas present, although I guess we kind of are returning to the ghost of Christmas present? Anyways, as the spirit stands aged and withered, with Christmas night drawing to a close, he reveals under his robe a pair of malnourished-looking children, which he says belong to mankind. Their names are Ignorance and Want. Once again, I can't help but to say that Dickens perfectly diagnosed the illness that would be persistent throughout the post-industrial world. Most economic mobility in the modern US relies on proper education and an environment that can meet the needs of children, which is sorely lacking right now. The Ghost warns that ignorance is especially dangerous, and statistics positively correlating crime rates with relative levels of education back up the spirit. There is certainly a need for prisons, but when men like Scrooge stereotype those they consider below them as criminals and layabouts, they perpetuate a cycle which makes institutions like that take on a greater burden, which in turn makes the staff running them take on a greater workload and makes them more liable to take out their frustrations on the prisoners rather than focusing on reforming them. Obviously, the whole reform thing wasn't that big of an issue back in Charles Dickens' day, but hey, I'm reading this as a dude in modern America. Realistically, Scrooge could never solve all of society's problems by being more generous. But he's capable of doing his part and lightening the burden, so that real change can happen. But keep in mind that the Spirit says they're mankind's children, meaning that it's up to all of us to solve the problems of ignorance and want.
Out! Oh, it's you, creep. God, aren't you supposed to be in the studio? We're on the air. Hey, back off, big man. That may work with the chicks, but not with me. Is this straight? May I? Did our people do that?
The Ghost of Christmas Future is the only spirit to appear prior to his own stave, descending upon Scrooge from above in the closing lines. Like so many deaths, he enters the scene unexpectedly and prematurely as his former cohort leaves. While the current depiction of the Grim Reaper with a scythe and black cloak is the product of centuries of ever-evolving mimetic art, I can't help but to wonder how much of its persistence, though, owes its credit to the many adaptations of A Christmas Carol. The term Grim Reaper doesn't show up in English text until 1847 in a translated text titled The Circle of Human Life, 4 years after the publication of A Christmas Carol. While the spirit is certainly a very on-the-nose representation of death, it's also worth dispelling a few misconceptions you might have about this ghost from his many adaptations. Close your eyes and imagine the hand that the Ghost of Christmas Future points with. Did you imagine a skeletal hand? If so, that's probably from a few different versions. But in the text, all we really get is that it's a single hand visible from his cloak. That is the one thing that makes his body contrast enough from the darkness to be visible. So based on that description, we can presume that it's a pale texture, but that's about it. Its silence could be reminiscent of our own silence at death, but given that it's also a representation of the future, I think Dickens is commenting on the uncertainty of what is yet to come. What the two previous spirits spoke of was set in stone, save for a certain Christmas party, that is. However, nothing the current ghost shows could be meaningfully commented on. Rather, it is Scrooge who must contemplate the meaning of the future set before him. While there are certainly no predetermined outcomes in the world, we can certainly imagine likely outcomes based on our current situation. The images Scrooge confronts are merely the likeliest outcome, and therefore an appropriate way to represent the future. Lastly, this ghost is unique in that it is the only one that allows itself to be directed by Scrooge. However, each wish he grants is something of a monkey's paw. And now the Greek god that the Ghost of Christmas Future reminds me of most is none of them. I really hope you weren't thinking that was going to be some kind of rule of three thing that I was going to bring to a satisfying conclusion. No, that would just be arbitrary. I mean, I guess I could say that he's kind of like Thanatos, the peaceful god of death, but honestly I've got nothing, so let's move on. There's a fascinating remix of the stages of grief that occurs in this stave. Rather than going through acceptance with the spirit at the end, he does so right from the very beginning, accepting that this is the only path to change. He asks the spirit, basically death, to lead him on. As a modern reader that's grown up on various versions of A Christmas Carol over the years, it's hard not to believe that Scrooge's ignorance of the identity of the dead man wasn't some form of denial. The narrator makes the associations to Scrooge pretty obvious, with some of them even benefiting from his death. Scrooge's denial is especially powerful when he stares at his corpse beneath the sheet. While I most certainly believe that Scrooge is genuinely shocked and terrified to see his name on the tombstone at the end, I have trouble imagining that this was ever a shock to anyone reading it other than the most gullible people. Scrooge, fearful and angry at this prospect of a lonely death, asks to see someone emotionally moved by his death, to which we are brought to a mother and husband relieved that their debt collector has passed on and will leave them just enough time to pay off their debts. From their perspective, Scrooge's death is an unexpected blessing that gives them a second chance. When Scrooge demands to see some tenderness related to a death, not specifically his death, we're brought to the abode of the Cratchits. Here, we see them still grieving from the death of Tiny Tim. Bob wears a brave face for the family, though they can see the toll it's taken on him in subtle ways, such as the way he walks. The way Dickens portrays depression is not by having the Cratchits give into it, but by having them fight it together, honestly, as a family, by going through the emotions of grief together. As with the breakup in the past, Dickens writes the dialogue as if life has always been happening, moving forward, and will always continue to do so. The death of their youngest member does indeed cast a heavy shadow, but they talk about looking forward to new opportunities, and mention how Scrooge's nephew offered him comfort which no doubt only cost him a few minutes of his time and little brain power. Even pointing to his grave, Scrooge still denies that he's seeing the aftermath of his passing. When we arrive at his burial site, Scrooge at last enters his final stage for this bizarre death journey, bargaining. He begs the spirit to tell him that this fate can be avoided if he changes, and the spirit remains ever silent. I've seen a lot of adaptations have Scrooge fall into the grave, but in the text, he just falls to his knees and grabs the spirit's hand before it transforms into his bedpost, and he awakes as if though from a nightmare. When we consider that this is meant to be a rebirth, it's not all that weird that Scrooge would experience the stages of grief in such a disorganized manner. Scrooge's reform here also bears some resemblance to reports of people who have had a near-death experience, acquiring a changed outlook on life and their priorities. In a metaphorical sense, you could say that his conversation with Jacob was a near-death experience on account of their proximity. An often overlooked question at this part is, what exactly was Scrooge trying to change about the future? While looking at Christian perspectives of A Christmas Carol online, I came across one post that believed Scrooge had conquered death by the end of the stave, buying himself a few more years. There are certainly a few adaptations that imply this to be the case, and I'll admit that this was even my assumption for many years until carefully rereading the text for this video. While Dickens explicitly states that Tiny Tim did not die, no such thing is ever said of Scrooge. While Scrooge's age is left ambiguous, several lines of text reference his advanced age and frail frame. Assuming he dies of natural causes, we have no evidence to suggest that he is rewarded with a longer life, or that he even expects to live a longer life. While I did mention that he bargains with the ghost of Christmas future to change his fate, he never actually bargains to have more time. In the closing paragraph, Dickens doesn't really give us any good reason to assume that Scrooge would live longer than a year, and instead focuses on his change of demeanor. Ultimately, Scrooge's death would be inevitable, so while it is possible that perhaps embracing family and friends gave him more time, his primary goal would still have been to change his legacy, not live longer. In this perspective, the Ghost of Christmas Future is giving Scrooge a terminal diagnosis, warning him that he only has a limited amount of time to get his affairs in order before it's too late. So while Scrooge is invested in giving Tiny Tim more time, we shouldn't assume that he ever plans to avoid his own death.
Tell me, what day is it?
What day? What's Christmas Day, Coaster?
Christmas Day. Christmas Day. Then I haven't missed it. The spirits must have done everything in one night. Of course, they can do anything, can't they? Of course they can.
Are you quite yourself, sir?
Having been reborn, Scrooge gets out of bed with a youthful energy and goes and does all the stuff you probably remember from every other adaptation, like asking the kid what day it is and sending the turkey over to Bob's house. Scrooge looks to some questionable evidence, like the fireplace and his bowl of gruel, to confirm his experience. I don't really understand how those objects prove that Scrooge had a supernatural visitation. But later in the stave, he visits his nephew's party and recognizes everybody there, which is actual evidence that he had a supernatural experience and wasn't just dreaming. Throughout the novel, the narrator is very complimentary to the people and environments that exist in the world, despite Scrooge's sour demeanor. However, in these final moments, it seems as though Scrooge's thoughts and the narrator have become one and the same. The book ends on December 26th in Scrooge's office, where he makes Bob his partner and plans to help his family. In a brief epilogue, Dickens considers that some around Scrooge might react to his change in character with cynicism. While a brief acknowledgement, it speaks volumes to the consideration of human nature, as well as to any readers who might suspect Scrooge of returning to his miserly ways once we close the book. Scrooge, caring more about his fellow man than wealth and reputation, easily dismisses their jokes, because he's truly happy now. Finally, Dickens ends the book on a joke, just before quoting Tiny Tim's "God bless us, everyone" line. He writes, "He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards." The total abstinence principle normally means to abstain from drinking any alcoholic beverages. But to Scrooge, who didn't have a drinking problem because it would have been too expensive, this is actually a pun, referring to how he didn't need any further help from spirits to be a good person. When I first started writing this, I thought I'd really have to argue for why A Christmas Carol could be read with a secular view, in spite of Dickens' religious affiliations. But it turns out that might have actually been the artist's intent to some degree. While he was most certainly a Christian, it turns out Dickens was actually a critic of dogmatic faith and religious institutions, such as the Church of England. Scrooge is initially scared into avoiding the hell-like punishment that his partner must endure for all eternity. However, the chains and intertwining symbols of avarice make it clear that Dickens is focused on a legacy of good deeds, not avoiding this afterlife that most Christian readers would dismiss as a fantasy compared to the one mentioned in the Bible anyways. Instead, Scrooge is given a more universal salvation in mankind. I know many Christians would argue that Jesus is a universal, but in this sense, I'm referring to universal as an experience, and I think that human connection beats out any religious experience. As I stated earlier, humans are communal creatures that have adapted to form close bonds and care for members of their tribe. We all know what it's like to care about family and to feel for those who suffer regardless of our background. If a hellish afterlife was all it took for Scrooge to change, then he wouldn't have needed to be visited by the three ghosts. It's only after examining how his past made him, how his actions in the present affect people, and contemplating on what his future could be like that he is finally driven to change. These are all themes which transcend cultures and ages. There are tons of references to Christianity as it was understood in Victorian England that are lost on most modern readers today, and yet generation after generation we retell it, retaining those themes which we can all relate to most. Fiction is a way of imparting traditions and values onto current and future generations, but the fact of the matter is that most stories in human history have a limited shelf life as popular stories. Sure, everything may be recorded somewhere and is easily available at our fingertips today, but in the grand scheme of things, there aren't many tales we can all claim to know collectively as well as A Christmas Carol, or even have seen as many different versions of it. And yet, for as many people who can tell you the outline of the plot, only a tiny fraction will ever claim to have read the original text. I think the question of whether A Christmas Carol is a Christian or secular text comes down to the reader and what connections it evokes in them. There's no doubt many lessons from A Christmas Carol that can be tied into the Bible. However, the fact of the matter stands that Dickens' classic has transcended the Victorian Christian demographic it was intended for by nearly 2 centuries, and has endured several cultural shifts, with few changes to the basic framework. People continue to look to Ebenezer Scrooge as a reminder that it's never too late to show kindness and generosity as long as there are still people to care for. From my perspective, A Christmas Carol is one in a long line of stories that reminds us of the importance of being human and seeing each other as equals in some capacity. In the Bible, there's the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. In it, Lazarus, a poor sick beggar, and an unnamed rich man who looked down upon Lazarus die at about the same time. Lazarus is taken to heaven by angels while the rich man suffers in hell. The rich man asks for a chance to warn his brothers, but is denied. In A Christmas Carol, Dickens has at long last given this rich man the opportunity to warn his brothers. Not only that, but he's also given him a reason to care about Lazarus, to reclaim his humanity. I'm also reminded of a story that comes from a tribe that says their god shared a meal with the first man. Hence, this tribe considers it inhuman to eat alone, which I guess would actually make me pretty inhuman by their standards. A Christmas Carol is about a man who has forgotten what it's like to eat with other people. While much of Scrooge's arc in this view is remembering what it's like to dine with others, Dickens also reminds us that we must be willing to invite Scrooge, the Cratchit family which relies on him for income, the community which profits from his charity, and his family which makes him wealthier than any amount of money ever could. Thanks for making it through my first video essay. I know that one was really rough, but in the future, I'm going to put a lot more work into these, and I've got a lot of content planned. But I'd also like to hear what people want to see in the Dog Bowl next. So if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please leave them in the comment below, and I'll take a look at them to see how they can help us fill the God-shaped hole in our hearts. I see everybody else do this, so I guess I might as well too. Please be sure to subscribe if you liked the video, and hit that notification bell if you'd like to stay tuned for what I've got coming up next. I feel really proud about this, and I hope to keep doing more.